Right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's now 11:15. We're now going to start our next session. Hope you've all had a lovely break. You've gotten up from your seats. You've had a cup of tea, you're refreshed and rearing to go. Now, please do not forget to use the hashtag BMEECRConfF. I'm going to put it in the chat in a minute, and tag at Open University and at Uni West London. I'm very grateful for those that have already been, thank you, Naomi. Thank you to those that have already been tweeting. It's brilliant, been liking it, been sharing it, well done. Now, it's back to the panel. Now, the panel is overcoming challenges and barriers. Overcoming challenges and barriers. And these are the people that will feature. The facilitator will be Lurraine Jones from the University of East London. And the panelist will be Dr. Winston Morgan from the University of East London. Dr. Amarachukwu Anyogu, currently at the University of Westminster. Dr. Deanne Bell from the University or Nottingham Trent University. Dr. Anthony Gunter, Open University, and Professor Layton Reid from the University of West London. So I'm going to swiftly hand over to our facilitator, Lurraine Jones. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadine. Good morning, everyone. Well, what a wonderful conference morning already. I'm sure you agree that it's already been a morning of insight, support, and a recognition of the many challenges within higher education for those who are from African and global majority communities. And I think we can all draw inspiration from wherever we are in our research or career journey. So as Bernadine says, the 5th Early Career Research Conference is entitled Moving On Up. And I'm honoured that Bernadine has asked me to be the facilitator of this panel, which is entitled Overcoming Challenges and Barriers. Such esteemed colleagues on this panel, really excited to ask them questions and to find their insights. So I'm going to introduce them in surname order. And I will only introduce them quite briefly, just to add a bit more, but to give them due regard, which is really important, actually. I'm going to introduce them just really briefly, as I'm sure you're really interested in what they have to say. But I do encourage you to look up their biographies in more detail and to follow them on social media if they have profiles. So Dr. Amara Anyogu is a lecturer at the University of Westminster, where she leads the foundation year in the Life Sciences programme. Dr. Amara's teaching expertise centres on creating learning environments that empower learners from diverse backgrounds to achieve their goals of succeeding in higher education. An active researcher, her interests focus on the interactions of microorganisms in food environments as agents of disease and food producers and her work is published in peer-reviewed journals. Good morning, Dr. Amara. Dr. Deanne Bell is a senior lecturer in psychology at Nottingham Trent University. She holds a PhD in depth psychology with a specialism in community psychology, liberation psychology and eco-psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. Dr. Deanne's work focuses on social transformation, given the reality of social suffering, structural violence and collective trauma, which is the global majority experience. She uses a decolonial framework, both within the university, where she's involved in decolonising the university, and more broadly, where she continues to study how we bystand social suffering. Dr. Anthony Gunter is a senior lecturer and programme lead for childhood and youth studies at the Open University. Good morning, Dr. Anthony. He's in the School of Education, Childhood, Youth and Sport. Previously, he worked as a principal lecturer in criminology and criminal justice at the University of East London. Dr. Anthony's research interests and expertise are in the areas of Black young people, youth cultures and transitions, serious youth violence and gangs, race, ethnicity, crime and justice, and policing multi-ethnic urban neighbourhoods. More recently, his work has focused on serious youth violence with regard to current policy, policing and preventative practice aimed at tackling street gangs, and youth-led and community-based driven solutions and interventions. Dr. Winston Morgan is a reader in toxicology and clinical biochemistry in the School of Health, Sport and Bioscience, and he is also the Director of Impact and Innovation at the University of East London. His bioscience research includes range organ toxicity, the toxicity of amphetamine-related compounds, the effectiveness of probiotics and prebiotics in gut health, and the wound healing and anti-cancer properties of phytochemicals extracted from medicinal plant materials. Dr. Morgan's research is involved in, Dr. Morgan is in researches into factors, particularly race, which determines medical and educational outcomes, and he runs workshops into how higher education institutions can increase the number of Black staff in senior positions. And lastly but not least, Professor Layton Reid is an architect, designer and academic and currently a visiting professor of research and external profile at the University of West London, and he is a visiting professor and researcher at ESNE Madrid. He's developing a game-changing suite of degree courses in IDEA architecture at the University of West London. Professor Layton was previously an associate dean at Ravensbourne University in London, where he championed diversity and inclusion. Professor Reid is the founder director of Desi Texture, a research-based practice that considers polycultural environments and sustainable cities. Good morning to you all, in the presence of such esteemed colleagues, some of which I've had the great pleasure to work with and know personally, and I'm very honoured to be on this panel. I'm sure everyone agrees that you are your ancestors' dream, and it's just amazing to see you all here. So I'm going to ask you questions to the panel. I'm going to ask you individually for the first one, and then hopefully we can have a discussion amongst yourselves for the participants, as there isn't an opportunity to do a Q&A on this one. We're using the time for you to have a discussion on your insights. You have had long careers in higher education, and we have many early career researchers here, as well as many established researchers and academics who would really just love to hear the insights that you have and your personal experiences. So I'm going to ask you all, just going on my screen here, if you don't mind, each, can you, Dr. Amara, please state 3 words that you feel Black and global majority early career researchers need to navigate higher education?
Thank you for that question. That was an interesting one, trying to distill it to 3 words, but I'll go with vision, community, and well-being.
Thank you. Dr. Anthony, your 3 words, please. You're on mute, which is
resilience, and resilience.
Fantastic, thank you. Dr. Winston.
I was really hoping I wouldn't have to answer these questions because, as my colleague said, it is really hard to distill down to 3 words. I suppose if you're a young early career researcher and you want a career in science, a long-term successful career in science, then you really have to, I suppose, a bit like Anthony, I'm going to say focus. You really have to be single-minded and focused.
Thank you. I know it is really hard to have 3 words, but it's like going for an interview, isn't it? When they ask you 3 words to how people would describe you, it's hard, but thank you so much. Dr. Deanne.
Lurraine, thank you for the difficult question to get things going. I think the 3 words most precious to me that I would want to share with other people is to decolonize our questions, our research.
Okay, thank you so much. And Dr. Layton, your 3 words.
Interesting one again. I think at the end of this rate, I'll probably have nothing to say. But just to reiterate some of my colleagues, focus, plan, perseverance.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, so in general, I'm not sure who wants to answer this one first of all, but of course we don't have that much time. So I'm asking you also the impossible, apart from the 3 words question, if you could give an insight, but almost briefly as well, so we can all have a chance to speak and hear your journeys, which are, you know, we could spend a whole hour on each of you and that wouldn't be enough. What were some of the barriers to your own journey to higher education and within it? Somebody like to answer before I pick on someone?
Okay, I'll jump in and say the barriers for just education generally. I mean, higher education was just something that wasn't in my worldview. I mean, just getting through secondary school, to get through that was for me a massive barrier. And so once I got to further education, and then actually understanding what education is about and that achievement and that attainment, then maybe you can see where you're going. But I would say, so Lurraine, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, what were the barriers to your own journey to higher education and then within higher education?
Okay, so as I said, the initial stage of your education is a barrier, because as a Black person, you know, you're, especially the Black male, you were seen as you're going to be a dustbin man, a prisoner. So there was no aspirations for you. But then once you think, okay, I can do this, I'm going to do this, the barriers are invisible, and it's about people not giving you those little conversations, those little bits of knowledge. So I did my masters, and colleagues were being lined up to do their PhDs, their this, and having little conversations at the pub with the professors. I was out of the loop. And so you've got to find your own loop. So you've always got to find your own way in almost. So that's the barriers.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Should I go next?
Yeah.
Well, and particularly because I'm following Anthony, where my experience is totally different. At school, I was a bright student. I came from a family where people did go into higher education, so it wasn't an unusual thing for me. It was one of the things that, for example, I like to tell people that my mother went to teacher training college. I mean, she got thrown out. I always tell people this because she got pregnant, but so it's not something that was unexpected of me. I knew what I wanted. I knew also that I wanted to go to university. What I didn't have and what was the barriers were the support from the teachers and all the kind of people around me who would say, right, this is what you needed to do. This is how much reading you needed to do. These are the things you needed to get there. So in terms of getting in, it was basically not having the support structures. And when I was there, again, I knew where I wanted to go. Because from the sort of first week of university, they brought in sort of like people who are in their final year and also PhDs and that kind of thing. And I thought, oh, that looks a really interesting thing to do. So I always wanted to continue my journey into academia. But then again, having people see me as someone who could become an academic was a difficult thing. So you always have to rely on yourself. So it's the barriers were always other people, not my own ambition or ability, but people not accepting and reinforcing it and supporting it.
Thank you. Dr. Deanne, would you like to answer?
I would, and I want to turn it a little bit in a different direction, because when I started to study psychology, I studied mainstream psychology. And then I was introduced to Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire, 2 incredible pillars of thought from the decolonial movement. And once I was introduced to them, my questions became very different. And there was absolutely no way in mainstream psychology that I could continue to pursue the lines of inquiry that were important to me and that I know to be important to historically marginalized people. So, for example, if I wrote a journal article that spoke to social suffering or collective trauma from communities I know in Jamaica and elsewhere, there is no chance in hell or heaven that they'll be published in a 3 or 4 star journal. So that's one of the colonial structures in the university. There is no chance in hell or heaven that Wellcome Trust or any other significant granting body would give me any significant money in order to pursue these lines of inquiry. So those are the barriers and the challenges that I want us to deliberate on, not to minimize the personal challenges that many of us face, because like anyone else, I face the daily challenge of how to face the academy, how to mobilize a kind of energy to step into the academy because it's so brutal and violent against historically marginalized people. So those are some of the structures and the systems that I think we need to pay attention to, and that can allow younger colleagues to not get trapped into colonial epistemologies and into colonial questions that will allow them perhaps to stand a chance of getting published in 3 and 4 star journals or getting access to grants. I think we need to decide that the kinds of research possibilities that exist for us as people who are historically marginalized.
Deanne, can I just ask you, who introduced you to Fanon and Césaire?
It was a radical white psychologist called Mary Watkins, who was chair of my doctoral work. And she didn't learn about Fanon in her mainstream psychology programs. And so this kind of thinking that infuses a more radical position is, you have to do tremendous amounts of extra work to move into this area, you know? And that's one of the deficiencies, a structural deficiency, again, that we don't allow people to study alternative strands of psychology. There is a hegemonic Euro-American version, or there's nothing.
Okay, thank you. As always, you speak with such passion, Dr. Deanne. Dr. Amara.
Thank you. I think when I read the question, when I thought about that question, I thought about it in 2 spaces. So getting into higher education as an undergraduate student, which I think I can really relate with what Dr. Winston was saying around coming from a family that expected you to go to university. Even though I did come into higher education as a mature student, I did feel like I was able to connect with my community really early. And I think that kind of framed how my journey in higher education was as an undergraduate student, and to a very large extent as a PhD, because I had the privilege and benefits of really wonderful academics that I think just saw me for my academic ability first and not anything else. I mean, even the opportunity to do a PhD it wasn't even something I had thought about. What was suggested to me by one of my professors, just because he thought, I worked really hard. But I think having come out of that, being a PhD, get your PhD, and then I felt like I had to face the world. So it was a kind of growing up of sorts and realizing that I had been living in quite a cocoon for a while. And it was quite different, trying to then establish yourself as an academic in your own right.
Thank you so much. Professor Layton?
I think that this is actually quite a practical question. It's not only one of the barriers, but what do you have to do to deal with the barriers? And the first thing to acknowledge is the general, let's go to Fanon again, cognitive dissonance. The academy finds it difficult to change because it would then have to make substantial change in itself. It would have to reevaluate itself, its direction, its choices. So what we have to do with a young researcher or a new researcher, early career researcher, is for them to understand what they're dealing with. If you understand what you're dealing with, then as someone like Baldwin might say, you become a weapon. You have the ability now to navigate what fissures there are within that system in order to propel yourself forward. And that's key, because it's pointless just pushing yourself against a sort of a brick wall. So those were the sorts of barriers I found. The system didn't want to study or look at what I wanted to look at. Couldn't understand what I said because the terms it used were, again, exclusive, and so I was excluded. And you can imagine people like Fallon having to produce new terms that people had to accept. That must have been extraordinary. And I think we're faced with that today. I think also there is a notion of being excluded, being not there, not being able to be heard. I think people only can see what they're used to. And I think that this inability to see one is essentially a function of education. It's a function of education that people essentially are inculcated into seeing and understanding things within set terms and agreed terms. So for the early stage researcher, they need to understand how to build allies, how to build networks, amongst people who are similarly minded or from the global majority who might have a range of interesting views. They must begin to establish those things quite early on. Otherwise, it becomes a lonely process and a difficult one which perhaps is charged with disappointment. The only other point I think with that is that I come from an art and design background. And one of my colleagues suggested that I was sort of an urban myth. Somebody looking like me who wanted to do what, in what way, and where. So that was, again, that's the very interesting thing. You have to understand that there is a lack of acknowledgement, but it's based in a form of dissonance, not even ignorance. If I'd said I wanted to be a footballer, I mean, even with this big face and this weight, they would have said, of course you could be the goalkeeper. They would have found a slot for me. So what you have to do is to align your research questions and your research work by doing conferences, attending events, meeting people, building this broad groundswell of association where people begin to see you and connect with you. Understand the language. What is the language that's used? How do people speak to each other and connect? If you haven't got that, it makes it much more difficult. There's a certain technical quality to how people speak, to either exclude or include. We all know this. Let's get with that. And then I think you can begin to, these are the practical steps you need to do to move yourself forward. So that's why I say plan. If you plan this, life can be so much easier. You'll find your way through. If you don't plan it, it becomes really rather frustrating.
Thank you so much. I think many established colleagues who are perhaps on this call wish that they'd had a conference such as this and to speak to and see such role models as yourself, and as we've seen earlier with Professor Wilson and Professor John, and indeed Bernardine for being such an entrepreneur in creating, Bernardine's created this space, which is such an incredible space for hearing these insights to help all of us. I always call these type of meetings as nourishing. Professor Wilson knows that I really use this word, that I find these things just so nourishing for the soul, and I really hope that everyone on this call today is getting that same nourishment. Is so important. So I'd like to ask to each of you, are the contemporary barriers to higher education for Black and global majority students the same or different to the ones you encountered? And why not? Shall we start with you, Dr. Morgan?
Oh, okay. Before I go there, I wanted to add something else about when I first started as a postdoc. My first postdoc, I remember we had this office, and it was shared with sort of PhD students or people who aspired to be PhD students as well as postdocs. And I remember the person who was to become my first PhD student, ironically, he looked at all us, the new postdocs, who were sitting on our nice new desks, as it were, and he said, You're all in competition. And I just sort of ignored him at the time. And in a sense, he was right, because that's something else that you need to remember. You start, all those people who start off an academic career as a postdoc, not all of you will make it. And it's those who are prepared and work harder, and there are obviously luck and other things they've got to go into it. But also remember, it's a competition. If you want that goal to be like Professor Layton at the end, it's going to be a competition. So you need to be putting in place all those things that you need, like your publications, making the networks, all those kind of things that will enable you to win that competition. So always remember, when you look across at your fellow postdocs, if you're a postdoc or if you're a PhD, well, you're in a competition, because everyone wants to get to that great place. Now, barriers. What I found for me is that when I first started, I suppose the barriers were more sort of overt. If we're talking about those kind of things, people would overtly block you, whereas now it's much more subtle. So you really have to look for it. I think that's the main thing that I've noticed. People will, when I first started, I remember sort of like technicians actually sort of talking to each other, and then you'd get back to you openly about, why do we have to do this work for this black XYZ, and I'd indirectly hear it. Whereas now they probably wouldn't do that, but they wouldn't say it out loud, but they would be less willing to do things, that kind of thing. So it's the barriers are more sort of like subtle now, but they're still there. I don't think it's any easier necessarily, because there are new challenges. It's just that it's harder for you to see, and so but they're still there. I might come back again afterwards, but I'll let someone else have a go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anthony. What would you say the barriers? Of course, Dr. Winston has just spoken about the covert and overt racism, which perhaps has changed over the years. So it's less covert. It's covert perhaps now. So what do you think has changed? And your to give early career researchers advice.
Sure. Thanks, Lurraine. Clearly, unfortunately, nothing has changed, because we're still in the same percentages that we were when I was starting my career. So I can't honestly say that anything has changed. They must be facing the same barriers, because that's why we're here today.
Yeah.
And let's specifically focus on black academics. Let's look at that. And coming back to a point Layton made, it's something that I really have a major problem with, which is, and I've always tried to bring my authentic self to what I do, and I will not use, I've had lots of PhD students, colleagues, who struggle because they feel they have to talk in a certain way, they have to write in a certain way, they have to almost pretend they're not who they are to fit in. And so those who do well, seemingly, it's like exceptionalism, isn't it? It's like, and then the establishment can then point to, well, we've got a professor there, look, so it's your problem, you're at fault. So it's almost like it comes back down on us, because we can't some of us don't want to appropriate that language, because we find it soul destroying. We go back to our families and we're eating our chicken, and we're talking too loudly, and we're laughing too loudly, and we're cussing and doing all the things that make us who we are. And then we come into a place like the OU, and all of a sudden we've got to be a certain way. And then if we talk a little bit too loudly, that person's aggressive, that person's threatening. How do you then navigate that? So I think it's an awareness of that double consciousness. And that's what we've got to navigate. We've got to be ourselves, but still understand that people will never see us for who we are. And even if we try to be like them, they still might not let us in. So I say you've got to be you, and you've just got to understand it's a lonely road sometimes. And even, there's a good point about making allies. I've always struggled with this. You go to conferences, and I remember I was a PhD student, and I went to it was a race conference. So these were, black and Asian and colleagues. And I asked a question to a colleague. He said, "What paper are you referring to?" Ooh, and walked off. I thought, I was stressful, and I thought, this is a room full of people who look like me, talking about the things I'm interested in. And it's like, I thought, I don't know if this is for me anymore. I don't know if I can do this. And before I finished this, I went to another conference, criminology conference, 2 years ago, and it was overseas. And another colleague, another black colleague who does my work, he was with all these other white academics, saw me and looked away. And it's like, and you think to yourself, this is what you've got to contend with. So you've got to be resilient. You've got to understand that even though you want to make network with people who hope, think, and feel like you, some of them might see you with a threat because they want to be the only black person in the room. So you've just got to navigate all these invisible things.
Thank you so much. I think from all the nods on the panel, and I'm sure at home everyone understands some of those experiences that you've had, and perhaps that comes back to Dr. Winston's point about competition, maybe, which maybe one of you want to pick up later. Are you in competition with others as researchers and academics, or are you sort of a collegiate? And yeah, so Dr. Deanne, can I just go on to you there in terms of your any advice for the early career researchers here? And are the contemporary barriers, just to touch back in with the question, are the contemporary barriers different in your opinion to the ones you experienced to today?
Lurraine, I think I take a long view to the university and to the systems that it has in place. And so I believe that current students experience similar barriers to what some of us have experienced, because coloniality in the university has been here for 500 years. So there are tweaks to it. There may be a few more of us historically marginalized people proportionately in the university, but we know even when that's true, we are stuck or blocked at the early career stage, which is why this conference is so important. So what I'm really saying is that historically marginalized people's knowledge continues to be made invalid. And in order for us to get some sort of validation within the university system, I think we are encouraged to sell our soul. We are encouraged to ask white questions. We're encouraged to use white epistemologies. And so what I think there's a fork in the road for many of us. Do we continue down the pathway of being in the university and being colonized by it, or do we attempt to decolonize the university through the very questions and the very epistemologies that we use? I think it's a political decision, but I think it's a very, very real decision, and it affects us deeply at the level of soul. And it's our decision to make. Are we going to continue down this path, which ruins many of us and makes many of us exit the institution long before we attempt to climb any ladder? Or are we going to be faithful and serve historically marginalized communities through our research?
Thank you, Dr. Deanne. Professor Layton, what is your opinion?
That was an interesting kind of quite wide-ranging series of views. Some of the views about the barriers that exist for us now, or for our young people, early stage researchers. To me, the barriers have changed in as much as I wasn't aware of the potential for doing a PhD. I didn't really. It wasn't part of my thinking at all. I thought I was lucky that I went to university at all. But for a lot of people, the difficulty now is in finding their route through to the right place with the right supervisor to support them through that journey. And I think that one of the key things is about, when I talk about speaking the same language, I don't mean about accent. I'm talking about the same kinds of blocks of knowledge and understanding, so that there can be a dialogue and the ability to introduce new blocks of understanding that would excite the person who's going to have to sign you on. And I write the recommendations for people doing PhDs, Black people, as well as some white people. And it's about being able to knit those things together that gives you that first understanding to become a PhD or an MPhil candidate, and that's really quite important.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing is that in my world, where there are so very few of us in art and design, making those networks with other people who are Black is normally out of a kind of quasi-professional stroke academic world, where the output of the professional world becomes the epistemology for the academic world. That is to say that we study the outputs, we then consider how those outputs into society and how they affect society, which is quite why, sort of, for example, in Italy, architects are often called doctori, because the body of work you produce at the end is essentially a thesis. And I think that's important to understand in terms of how you make those relationships. It may be more difficult in other subjects to do that, but I would absolutely repeat that making allies and friendships amongst people who are like you, however painful it may be, however they may seem for some of you to turn your way, I think it's really important that you do that. Even if someone seems not to be interested, they live in a state of fear. They live in a state of fear in relation to their colleagues as to whether they're talking to the right people or not. And you have to help to develop that. You can't dismiss it and simply say, they didn't want to talk to me, we're like crabs in a barrel. And we're going to stop that. If we're going to move forward, we are worthy. I think that the thoughts and our considerations are important. And people, when you speak to them, actually feel, for the first time, a burden lifted from them to share and to. Well, that's what I find. Perhaps it's just me. But I would hope that others would follow that course.
Thank you so much. There is research that shows that particularly Black students find navigating white spaces quite difficult, which I'm going to ask you a question about that later. And so networking often involves, if you're physically going to a conference, historically that can be quite a difficult thing to do, because you are going up to another white academic that perhaps you've used, etc., and you're quite afraid to try and make those connections. But I'm coming to you in a moment, Dr. Amara, but actually forcing yourself, as you say, planning your route and forcing yourself to shake those hands, which historically other white people have been doing for years. They know the rules of the game. They know how to network, and they use the legacy of their ancestors, I suppose, which many Black people do not have that and have to learn it. So this conference is just an example of giving those tips and insights as to how to do those things. So Dr. Amara, do you need me to touch back in with the question, as I've left you to last?
No, I think it's fine. I think one of the biggest barriers, for early career researchers really comes from the academy maybe being unwilling or unable to acknowledge that, to many extents, for BME early career researchers, it is a space that normally says that you don't belong there. You don't see people that look like you, and even when you see them in more precarious positions. You don't really see them at the top. I've worked in higher education for a while. I can't recall ever having another Black, so I tend to be the Black woman in the department or in the school, and especially being in science. And so much work then comes to the person. So it becomes who you're able to connect with in that space. And I know that, it almost becomes like an additional thing that you do as a BME academic, that you are doing your work, but you're also trying to be that support to those students, to those PhD students, because it's, it isn't easy to navigate it. And it's one of the reasons why one of my keywords at the beginning in the first question was community. You need that community. You need the sponsors, the mentors, but you also need, I call them the fan club, because you're going to need people who are going to continue to remind you that this isn't just something that you're thinking, that it's real, and that will continue to tell you that the work that you do is valid. Maybe it isn't valued in this space, but it is valued. So I think a very big consensus in this discussion is that we need people. because, you know, we are not well represented. So we just need to find who that community is. And I think, you know, I would recommend as early as possible to recognize who are the key people. And sometimes it might be one of those 6 degrees of separation. So you need to find the person who will connect you to the person who will connect you to someone. So I think being in a space like this is amazing. I was at the first conference, and it really helped me to change the way I thought about the issue. I think I came into, you know, being an early career academic from a very naive standpoint. So I had a lot of learning to do on the way. But I think that's it, because it's going to be about people. The policies look good on paper, but they don't always translate into practice that works.
I think one of the certainly one of the things that, well, I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues the other day about Professor Marcia talks about the invisibility of things, but one of the there are so very few Black and global majority academics, particularly Black academics, that sometimes it feels Black students tend to speak to, I'm sure this is your experience, that tend to come to you sometimes, and that's additional work, which is invisible. It's not in any sort of what we call an AWAM, a sort of work model, but also we do it for the betterment of the community and for individuals, and to see many more Black researchers, but, you know, become academics, become the lecturers, the doctors, the professors. It's so important, even though we do it and it's invisible work, which also, as Dr. Deanne mentioned earlier, does have an emotional impact as well sometimes when students are expressing their challenges. But we're here for you, because that's why we've shown up today, and that's why Bernadine started this whole thing, and everyone has turned up. So please, we just really encourage you to continue that journey. Just I haven't given you this question before, but just to show that you do have a sense of humour, one of the important questions I need to ask you, and I'll ask you in order, is it plantain or plantain?
It's plantain.
Doctor,
let me just tell you, it's plantain. I am from Jamaica. Please don't stretch it out. It's plantain.
Plantain. Dr. Deanne, Dr. Layton, do you have an opinion?
It is absolutely planted. I am also Jamaican. regardless of how some people might view my voice. I am a Jamaican, authentic. I'm authentically Jamaican, and it's planting, and you fry it.
Okay. Small island, big island, as they say. Dr. Winston.
If Deanne says it's planting, then it's planting. Really, and interestingly, I mean, I don't like to talk about sort of like the sort of separation and difference in terms of islands, but there are 4 Jamaicans or people of Jamaica, at least 4 Jamaicans on this panel. I don't know what that says. You
will let us know that they are from Jamaica, as we know.
Yeah. But interestingly, also, and perhaps it might have an impact on this early career thing, is have had some of their early education away from this country.
Yes.
And that is quite a big thing. I've seen that in the data as well, that a lot of people, if you can get your early education, but it shouldn't sort of deter anyone who has had all their education here. But I have noticed that in the system, perhaps there's a little more resilience about something else. I don't know what it is, or the ability to not be knocked back, or you have ways of navigating if you've had some of your early education elsewhere. But it shouldn't be the way. This is now our country, and we should, and our education system, it should support all of us. Yes. So
thank you.
Planting.
Thank you. Dr. Amara.
Well, I'm Nigerian.
Be authentic. Yes, I know. So, okay.
I am Nigerian, so it's plantain for us, and it is fried, and it is boiled, and it is put in pottage, and it is pounded as well. So yeah, we eat it in different ways.
Thank you. And Dr. Anthony, I know you'll bring your authentic self.
Yes, I'm a Brummie. I don't know about the Jamaican business, but my mother and my would say she's a Westmoreland woman, and she's planting.
Okay.
Westmoreland, no Jamaican, Westmoreland.
Thank you so much. I wanted to bring a bit of, another bit of authenticity and ways of knowing, as we know when we come together as a community. So I'd like to ask you the next question, and I'm going to start with Dr. Amara. What do you wish you had known about higher education when you were an early career researcher?
Wow, this is a deep one. I think how inequity worked really in this space. I think that I came in thinking, just like I had in my undergrad, it was very academic, work very hard, you put in the hours, you study, you get a first in the module, you get a first overall. But I brought that same mindset to my EC, as a, PhD student, and in my first kind of role. And it took me too long, I think, to realize that it wasn't necessarily about that. You could do a lot of hard work and still be invisible. But I thank my friend Deborah for this statement about being hypervisible and invisible at the same time in academia, where you are hypervisible for certain things, supporting students, EDI work, etc. But you're invisible when it comes to yourself. For example, for me as a scientist, so I'm recognized for doing any initiatives that have to do with EDI, supporting our students.
Yeah,
and I've always worked in widening participation, because that's really where my passion is. I really want to see underrepresented groups come into higher education and take all the benefits that it has to offer to really, because I truly believe that HE, when we do it the right way, can change lives and it should transform lives. But you find that you're carrying a lot of work and it's not necessarily taking you in the direction that you want to be professionally. So I think that it's something I would definitely give as advice to anyone who's starting out. You need to recognize how it works in your space, and it might be different depending on the institution that you're in, but it's trying to find that balance of knowing what's the right thing to do, but also knowing how that fits into your bigger picture, because the progression is important as well. You're not just in this space to do some work, you're in it to develop professionally as well. So I think that is, if I had to say only one thing, that is what I'll say. But if I could sneak in just one last, I would say that I'll go back to Audre Lorde's statement about your silence not protecting you. I'm an introverted person. I'm not someone who is given to. But I think that we need to find our voice and not allow anyone to silence us. I think that sometimes we keep silent because we're afraid, of course. But it's good to set the boundaries, I think, and I think that we need to speak out about things that endanger our well-being or even our sense of security and safety. I think we need to speak up. So yeah, I would say those two things.
Thank you so much. Dr. Deanne?
So I wish, when I first started to study psychology, I was studying mainstream psychology, of course, and I didn't know that that was one culture's way of looking at psychological life. And that's the coloniality of knowledge, right? I just thought, well, this is the story that is supposed to explain it all. So my one wish, and the work that I'm trying to do at NTU to create opportunities for PhD researchers to ask their own decolonial questions, is that I wish I had been introduced to decolonial thought and praxis from the get-go. I wish they were offered side by side so that I could have chosen. Because what it did is it contributed to the colonization of my mind, because I kept thinking, well, this is it. And it's not it. And hopefully that's part of the invisibility in next year's conference, is actually taking up this question of what has been made invisible to us that traps us in the colonial structure that we are already in. So that's what I wish. I wish that we explode the sources of knowledge that we are engaging in and that we introduce our students to. That to me would be dreamy beyond dream.
Thank you so much. Professor Layton, what do you wish you'd known about higher education when you were an early career researcher?
Yeah, I haven't got a straight answer for it, so I'll do a quick ramble, a very quick ramble. I wish I'd known just how patronizing an environment it would be when you try to bring questions about, for example, issues of I suppose the roots understanding of the design of structures related to climate meant producing things they produced and their values, which we now finally, since sustainability has taken root, since BLM, it's suddenly there is now beginning an understanding of why things are created the way they are using materials. Those sorts of things, biomimicry, etc. And I wish those things were available to me then, because I wouldn't have felt so lost and alone. And I wouldn't have also wasted so much time having to justify those things. And now there are some great networks here and in America, in particular in America, that begin to allow you to have a voice and to develop, and people want to come onto those bandwagons. I think the notion of isolation, again, because some of the things that you're looking at are so different to other people's, and having to use their authorities in order to justify your position. I don't see why. I don't see why a song by Marvin Gaye can't be as much a piece of poetry as Shakespeare's sonnets. I think that's a fundamental for me. For other people, it may seem to be kind of a bit weird. I think that those sorts of understandings I didn't have at the time. Those are some of the changes that I think are really important. The other thing I think that's kind of interesting is that one of the real obstacles is if you're going to do a PhD part-time, is getting a post that allows you to do it. There's a reality. People have to make a living, and if you're not going to get an award that allows you full-time study, what do you do? And I know that in my early days, that wasn't available. So we have to look at that, and I think we should be trying to bring together funds which allow that people from our kind of groupings to move forward. That allows them to access those sorts of aspects of study.
So through scholarships. For example, through scholarships.
There's about 100 companies in the world that are putting aside between $1 million and $100 million. We need to access those funds. We need to organize. I think this notion of agency is within us. We can't wait for someone to do it for us. And if they did, we should reject it. We should reject it because it is somebody else's imposition of a viewpoint. It means it would kill our own voice. I think that's really important.
Thank you. It's very much in line with Professor John's view. Yep. Thank you. I was a while ago, well, it's actually a few years ago, I saw a program, and it was actually Lenny Henry speaking to Akala, and they were showing, they took clips from Shakespeare and clips from Jay-Z words. And Akala was saying, because Akala uses Shakespeare to teach children and to get children to try and understand Shakespeare, which is really important as well, he feels. And so there were kind of quotations from from Shakespeare and quotations from Jay-Z, and he was asking Lenny Henry, where did this quote come from? It's quite incredible, in terms of social commentary. And Lenny Henry picked, said that's Shakespeare, and he said no, that's Jay-Z, or the other way around. It's really quite interesting, and it was a way to reach young people, young Black people, to show how words, as you said, around Marvin Gaye, for example, there are other ways of knowing and other ways of teaching, and that's really what Dr. Deanne is really emphasizing. Dr. Anthony, what do you wish you had known about higher education?
I think the loneliness and the isolation, the loneliness, the day-to-day loneliness in your department. So as much as you make connections with across your day-to-day work is isolating, it's lonely. and also hostility. I remember colleagues when I'm going in to invigilate an exam, and a colleague shut the door. "You're not allowed in yet," thinking I'm a student. I remember going to the car park and, "Hey, hello, you can't park in here," and just a daily, what they call microaggressions, but I say macroaggressions, that you have to deal with as a black academic. And then you've got all that physical stuff, but then you have to write in a particular way. But no matter how you write, as soon as the subjects you write about are the things that you see for your world, they're marginalized. It's less than. So, and even the way come back to Layton's point again, talking about it's not about accent, but what you write. But I'm always challenging my PhD students because they write in this and I'm saying, but that's not how your brain works. You can make your point really intellectual, sharp point, drawing on all these things, but you don't have to be using this Euro-American way of this is how you to be an intellectual, because then they get lost in the language and not the ideas, and it's a way of excluding people. The academia as it stands at the moment, it's a way of keeping people out. So any great idea should be able to be. If we're all teachers, which we all are here, we should make complex ideas simple. That's what the idea of but where we're in now, we make simple ideas more and more complex, and then more and more complex, and then complex again, to keep people like us out. And so I think I want to be positive and say, just be aware about all of this. Try and get support where you can, but also just to remember, many of us will have mental health problems if we try to navigate this on our own. We're not super people, we're people, we're flesh and blood. And it's what Amara said, we're doing two jobs, two roles. That's going to have a psychological impact. So we need self-help from an institutional level to say it's black people. There's a university accepting something about the Black Lives Matter and how that impacts on our mental health, and it's a disability, not disability, a sickness or some sort of thing. You can get some kind of help because it's an additional stress. These are institutional things that should be put on us, rather than us saying, you can get through, black student, go on, you can get, we do it ourselves, yeah, really? And the others you can't, that make us weak.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Winston, what do you wish you'd known about higher education when you were an early career researcher?
Wow. Okay. Before I come to that, just following on about some of the things my colleagues have said about the thing about STEM, and I suppose Amara and I will know, that's our area, is that in STEM there's ontology and epistemology. I can never say these words. There's only one ontology, one epistemology in science, and if you can't fit that, you're not going to be successful. And it's trying to get, match, basically someone else determines whether you've met that standard, and that's one of the challenges with STEM. You have to write in a certain way. You have to have a certain idea, and if you don't fit that, then it is really hard to be successful. Now, in terms of early on, I suppose on one level I was quite idealistic, and I sort of, you'd think that, and you'd see academics as these ideal people, and you'd expect them to be fair and equal and that kind of thing, but they're not like that in reality. And perhaps it's something that if one knew, I talked about this idea of the 5 postdocs sitting on the chair, and you're thinking, if I work as hard as my colleagues or even harder, I'm going to be successful. But the reality, there are other things going on that perhaps will not make that possible. The other thing is, I wish I'd met someone like me who'd had the experiences that I could have had a conversation with the Winston that's now, all the things that I know now that I can pass on to someone starting out their academic careers about, for example, not taking on too much EDI work because you feel you have to do it. And letting that frame you when you should be basically doing science, and seeing your scientific colleagues just doing science and publishing, whereas you are trying to do your science plus do EDI work, and then all those kind of extra burdens that you have to carry with you. I would say to my postdoc who's just starting out now, try to avoid that. I'm not saying don't do it, but don't let it become the thing that frames you. be the, you know, because most of us, well, whatever academic discipline we're in, we do it because we love it. So focus on that rather than being driven in a direction that other people want you to go into. But like I said, it's, if you get a chance to talk to someone who's had experience, like any of us on this panel, and there are more of us than people think in HE sector, seek them out, have a conversation with them. You don't have to take on everything they say, but they'll have some experiences that you can benefit from long term. So yeah, that's what I would say to my younger person, if you like, my younger self.
Thank you so much. A couple of things to add to that really is that sometimes you do EDI work because you're expected to do it, and sometimes you do it because you love it. But I think most of the time we do it because we have to. We just feel we have to do it. And there is that invisible burden, but we do it. But I do agree that sometimes your work can get go on a diversion, and you're so busy trying to help other people that you're not doing things yourself, which is difficult. I'm at UEL at the moment, University of East London, and I'll just drop this in because other people might want to consider doing that. Is that I started something called the Black Academy at UEL, of which Dr. Anthony was at UEL himself, and Dr. Winston remembers this, and Dr. Deanne had already unfortunately left UEL and gone to Nottingham, Trent. But what that was just basically was me getting Black academics together, a group of us. There were 26 of us. We had a conference. I had a Wakanda moment where everybody was just facing the audience, and we each spoke about our journey to higher education. And it was an amazing evening. It was so warm. Even if there weren't any students there, we just felt just amazingly warm, and just in fact got in touch with each other afterwards, and still have that beautiful feeling amongst us. So that if there are any academics online who want to do that, I think it's such an important thing to have a Black Academy, because at UEL there are so many mature students that often you can't tell who is an academic. You just can't, it might be a little bit different in other universities, but we still and that Black Academy, we've had a few sort of forums, and the Black students have said how amazing they see role models, they see people who look like them, and that is an inspiration in itself. And today is one of those inspiring moments. So thank you again, Bernadine, for that. So some years ago, Janet Morgan, who's running a workshop this afternoon, so I will name check her, and I hope that she's still on this morning. I went to a Black leadership workshop, and I began to from there really I understood the difference between a mentor and a sponsor, and I've used this many times myself. That a mentor is someone who can be of similar ilk to you, who often gives you a cup of tea and a cuddle and a whatever and help. But a sponsor in an institution is highly likely to be white. It's highly likely to be white, and it was a real revelation for us in this workshop to understand that. And I just wanted to ask you about that, because some people in the workshop felt really uncomfortable with that, but also it was an aha moment that actually a sponsor is highly likely to be white, and particularly as Professor Layton mentioned earlier about networking, that really you need to understand a mentor can be your peer, a sponsor is highly likely to be white. And you need to have that connection, because a sponsor is someone that will advocate for you in spaces that you often cannot get into, but you want to be there. Okay, so I'd like to ask each of you, starting with Professor Layton, do you think having a mentor and or a sponsor is important for an early career researcher? And does it matter if their ethnicity is different to your own?
It clearly is important that you have someone who can help you chart a course, territory which you have no knowledge of, where you see nothing like yourself, particularly in the UK. Right? We are there, but we're hidden in the long grass. You don't see each other. I think it's so impenetrable that an anecdote. I was first made a visiting professor at the University of Essex. And I returned to my host institution to tell them that it was a great thing. He turned to me and said, the head of quality said to me, "You can't make this. I don't believe you." He said, "Bring me the paper." The next day I brought the letter.
Wow.
And I presented that to him in an office full of people. And he was so contrite, because it was never part of his thinking. So this is why a sponsor is really quite useful and important. How you get a sponsor is another matter altogether, but I think it's important. A mentor, somebody who can share with you insights, those sorts of things, again, is really very useful. But it's difficult. The important thing is not to be alone. And you can begin to draw on strands of people who have been through similar sorts of experience by putting yourself in positions where those people exist around you. It's a difficult area to navigate. Sometimes you have to really just ask someone, because they're not presented to you, unless we can build networks to do that. So I'm part of an organization called Ikenga, which is trying to put together a series of mentors or people from industry and academia to support people who are moving through the system. I think that's probably, anybody can come up and say, I need some assistance, I need some know-how, and we can be a function for them. So I think that's this notion of doing it for yourself, of making yourselves available, which you all already do, is really quite important, but nobody knows where to get you from. So we've set up Ikenga in order to do that. And I think that's how I'd like to put it, because I wouldn't wish to put our past sponsors, make them feel, my gosh, I don't want to do that again. And I want to encourage them to stay with us. Help support.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Dr. Deanne.
So, Lurraine, I think of my presence as a Black woman from the Global South in the academy as a political one. And so I'm on the hunt for colleagues who I can share a politics with and a commitment to social transformation of the university. And therefore, to be able to experience solidarity. So I'm not on the hunt for a mentor or a sponsor so much as I am for solidarity in the academy.
And what is your advice to an early career researcher?
I would say that if you need someone to look up to in a particular kind of hierarchical way, which I know to be a colonial way of doing relationship, then do those things. But if you believe that your presence too in the academy is political, then seek out building solidarity. You know, I think Amara at the top of our conversation was talking about community, and that to me, a very activist community where we hold each other together through the daily struggles. Tony was talking about some of the really, really hard things that we have to face, that all of us on this call, or most of us, will have lived experience of. You know, if we can develop solidarity networks, then I think we can take care of each other in ways that hierarchical relationships like mentorship and so on may not attend to. That's my view.
Thank you. Dr. Winston, do you think having a mentor or sponsor is important for an early career researcher? And does it matter about ethnicity?
In terms of mentors, I'm always sort of cautious when people talk about mentors, because I always feel that mentor is basic, especially when they say you need a mentor. It's normally sort of a kind of deficit thing where they're saying you're not there already. And for most of us, when we apply for a position, or when we're in the academy already, we've done all the other things. It's not mentoring that we need. That's what I think sometimes it is, whereas I do believe sponsorship is quite important, because a sponsor, the way I see a sponsor, is someone who can talk you up to an external body or about how good you are, And we don't have any of that simply because people don't normally see us in those positions. So I say, if you can have a mentor a sponsor that can talk you up to an important, say an interview panel or someone who would be thinking about you, then I definitely think sponsors are really good. And I just want to embarrass Bernadine a little, and it sort of relates to what we were talking about. I mean, Bernadine and I worked at UEL on and off for about 2 years in the same department. She taught the same students as I did. But during all that, and there were lecturing jobs had come up, and perhaps I'm also embarrassing my university. And during all that time, no one could see, we were talking about this visible versus invisible thing, and no one could see her as the great person, the great leader, and the great school that she's become at West London. So it's only when, it took her someone else to spot her potential and her, not even potential, her, what she was doing, and said, right, we must have this woman in our organization, not just in our organization, but leading our course. Whereas she was at UEL, people saw her work, but yet they couldn't see what she could do. And so they allowed her to go somewhere else. But then sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes you're in an organization where people can't see your talent, and then you try somewhere else. And then she talked about Marcia sponsoring her. So when you go somewhere else, you can get a sponsor to talk you up in a different way that the organization that you're in couldn't talk you up. So so sponsors are really, really important. So I just wanted to throw that in because, as I said, Bernadine was talking earlier, and I'm just thinking, she's done so well in one organization, yet another organization had the opportunity to give her that, and they couldn't see her.
Thank you. And look what she has done.
Exactly.
And we do also have to once again acknowledge Professor Marcia Wilson, who's been, she's been my sponsor, an incredible sponsor. She has, and once again, she's been in a position of power, and she's brought people up behind her. She's just, everybody knows her for that. Just, incredible. And Bernadine and myself and many of us who know Marcia, and even if you don't, let me just say, she's such an incredible person in every way. She just really is. There are not enough accolades for Professor Marcia Wilson that are available, in my opinion, and many others. Dr. Amara, we're drawing to a close, so I've got Dr. Amara and Dr. Anthony just to finish off with the last question, which is, do you think having a mentor or sponsor is important for an early career researcher?
I would say yes, to both. I think you need both. I think a sponsor is important, and given, just as you explained, it's rare that the person will come from the same ethnicity as you are, just given the kind of representation we have at more senior levels. And it's really about those sort of conversations that I had in rooms where where, if I can use the word power, where people with power are that you're not in, and how you are presented. And I have seen different examples of how people's reputations are damaged because of people's perceptions of them, and they are not given an opportunity to contribute to those conversations. So I think having a sponsor, but again, everything has to come back and align with your values. I don't necessarily see it in a hierarchical space. If I think about it in community, it's like in every community, different people have different roles and bringing different things to the table. I think I see a mentor as someone who has almost walked in those steps before you and can actually give you some insight that you might not have. And I think sometimes you need that, because you need to know that isn't you, it's the system.
And
absolutely. You need someone who can say, and a mentoring relationship doesn't necessarily need to be something that will last forever. You can go to a space, and I've sat in spaces for 1 hour with people, and it's been very impactful for me. And I never had the opportunity to see them again because they're very busy. But it didn't, it gave me a different perspective. It helped me with my decision making. I think with a mentor, though, having someone come from that same space as you will be beneficial. But not to say that that's the only way. I mean, I've had great sponsors from different ethnicities, and I've had great mentors as well from different ethnicities as well. Because I think at that crucial early stage, where It's really where, are you going to get into the academy or not? I think you might need something slightly different than when you are already in the academy and trying to navigate your way through it.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Dr. Anthony.
I would say it's essential that you have a sponsor, and my training and my practice has been informed by being a community and youth worker, and our model was you start with young people and who were seen as marginalized, as got nothing to contribute, and you build their confidence up. And so my work, seeing young people come through from 8, 9 to become project leaders, to become project managers. So I've taken that into the academy, and I wouldn't be in the academy if I didn't have a white sponsor, because who's going to open the doors for me? I was given, I got a PhD studentship from a white sponsor, who, all other doors were shut to me, but this person sort of valued my work, valuing me. And so I've continued that on, and in my department previously, it was all white. And as soon as I could have any influence, we changed it, and we managed to bring different people in, black people in, black colleagues in. So it is essential that we have sponsors, because otherwise the statistics will look as bad as they look now in 20 years' time.
So just to conclude, Dr. Amara, Dr. Anthony, Professor Layton, Dr. Winston, Dr. Deanne, I'm honoured to be on this panel, to be able to ask you questions, to facilitate this discussion. You are an inspiration to me. I've worked with some of you. You really are an inspiration to me. I'm sure you're an inspiration to everybody on this call. You are, as I say, just to repeat, your ancestors' wildest dream, and it's just quite incredible. I do have to add, I'm really lucky to be joining Professor Marcia Wilson, who is the Dean of EDI OU. I am joining her as Deputy Dean in September at the OU. So hopefully we will do something. I flippantly called us the Batmina and Robina of EDI. Perhaps we'll become that. I hope our paths cross in the future. I'd like to encourage everyone who's an early career researcher on this call to just keep going. Please take on board everything that everyone has said. You've got years and years and years of experience and wealth of knowledge here, and I do really wish you all luck. Thank you so much.
Thank you ever so much. People, please show your appreciations. I think we have some clapping hands thing. Let me play. Yes, let's see loads of them going throughout the screen. Now, thank you very much, Dr. Winston, for sharing my experience when I applied for a position at a lectureship position at UEL. And I need actually to embarrass you and say you were helping me behind the scenes to make sure I was the best. And I deeply appreciate that, because I know you were really, really busy, and I'd say, please look at these answers to these questions, make sure. But as a woman of faith, I believe God had a master plan. And if I was with you guys, I wouldn't be where I'm currently am, making such an impact. So thank you very much. Now, we've come to the end of this session. It's now time for your lunch. Please do step away from your screen and go for lunch. You need to get some fresh air. You need to be energized, because after our keynote speaker, we are going to start our workshops. So please step away, be back precisely 1:15, 45 minutes. And we will commence with our keynote speaker, second keynote speaker, Professor Fumi Olanishakin, Vice President, Principal, International King's College London. Thank you, everybody. Bye for now.